The African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, literature, and journalism. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they'd been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and joining us on today's program is William C. Rhoden, New York Times sports columnist, and we're going to be talking about how things have changed in relationship to black athletes in our society. And Bill, this is the 50th anniversary of Jackie Robinson's entrance into Major League Baseball, and many writers in your profession are saying that this is a perfect example of how we've got social integration in American society. What do you think about that line of thought?
I can't say it on family TV, but yeah, I mean, they would say that. I was at a Jackie Robinson conference at Long Island University, I guess it was in March or something, and it was very interesting. You know, I was going in and one of my colleagues, a white colleague who writes for Newsday, stopped me, and he said, you know, somebody I don't really talk to a lot, and he said, you know, have you noticed that there are like very few black people here? You know, why do you think that is? And really, I hadn't really noticed it, because you know, I've been at the Times for 15 years, and when you go to most of these sporting events, you don't see a lot of black folks in the stand. I mean, they're basically players. You don't see many of us doing a concession or anything. Mm-hmm. So I was sort of like, I was just got into that mode of being not going to see any black people, you know. But he asked me that, and I started thinking about it. And the answer to that is kind of complex, and it gets to some truths that they don't want to hear. So I was on a panel, Dick Schaap was on the panel, and Ira Burkhardt, some other people. And when it was my turn to give my little spiel, I said, you know, it's very interesting that this is the 50th anniversary, it's very nice, but you got to understand two things. Number one, in 1947, when Jackie Robinson broke in, there were no African Americans. I guess that's okay to say that now. Black, whatever you know. But in 1947, there were no African Americans writing for the quote-unquote major media, sports media, none. Interesting, in 1997, there were only two covering Major League Baseball. There were only two African Americans covering Major League Baseball on a daily basis. 1947, when Jackie Robinson broke in, of course, there were no black sports editors at your major media. 1997, there are two. 1947, when Jackie Robinson broke in, there were no black columnists working for the major media. 1997, you got 1,600 newspapers, you got 10 black columnists. So, you know, before we start getting carried away with, you know, how great this is and what a feel-good thing, we have to understand that most of this whole celebration is being articulated by white sports writers, white male sports writers. That's all there was then. But I'm more disturbed that people don't know who Sam Lacey is. And I asked a young white sports writer, said, you know, see, it's funny how they turn these games around. They'll talk about how, you know, they'll talk about, well, isn't it pitiful that the guys don't know who Jackie Robinson is? And they always bring up Vince Coleman. Yeah. Well, number one, I asked Vince Coleman that, because see, Vince Coleman went to Florida A&M, and he played for Jay Gaither. Now, you can't play for Jay Gaither, you know, Eddie Robinson, and not know who Joe Louis is, Jackie Robinson. Now, what Coleman says, what happened is that Dick Young asked him after some game they lost. Apparently, he must have broken some record or tied some record. And Dick Young, who everybody knows, was no liberal at all, was not what you call a friend to black people. So you always have to be concerned with that kind of person is suddenly talking about what black people don't know. So he apparently asked Vince Coleman something about some record he broken. So apparently Coleman said something, man, I don't know anything about Jackie Robinson's record, or something like that. He didn't say, I didn't know who Jackie Robinson, but see, people love to take that and run with it and then turn the issue into something else. Not the fact that there are no black people in the media, but Vince Coleman doesn't know who Jackie Robinson, you know. So I've got a lot of mixed feelings because, you know, I love Jackie Robinson, I love what he stood for, but you have to understand too that if you ask why there weren't a lot of black people, well, because frankly, there's a great ambivalence about everything that's set in motion. There were black journalists, Joe Bostic, a number of people who were warning black people, don't do this. Said, don't do this. Once you do this, we've got an infrastructure of business here. This is a in 1947, it was $1 million business. Negro League Baseball was $1 million business because you had black reporters covering the teams, you had black newspapers getting advertisement, the secretaries were black. Bostic wrote, and I read this to him at that conference. I read a column he wrote, and the essence of it was that, do you think that when we integrate, these jobs are going to go to black people? And 50 years later, he's right. You know, so I think that there's an ambivalence because what that set in motion is basically the destruction of one institution, and it's something that really hasn't recreated itself. And you've seen it happen in a number of other areas. You talk about desegregation. Well, what happened is that they integrated a black institution into a white institution, and because of the specter of white supremacy, that anything white is better, people who were black principals suddenly became teachers. People who were black superintendents weren't superintendents anymore. People who had black coaches were assistant coaches. That's something that we have not. What they did, though, they took the great black athlete, the great black student, and continued to enrich themselves, you see. And so in many ways, and I see it now, when I look at the NBA, you know, everybody, oh, isn't it great that the NBA is a black league? The NBA is not a black league. The NFL is not a black league. Yeah, you have 60% black players in the NFL, and you have, you know, 80%, whatever that is, in the NBA. But all you got to do is go to Madison Square and look at this power infrastructure. You know, the people who are taking your tickets, the people from the bottom all the way to the top, linearly and vertically, we're not in it. All we are is what we were in 1865 and the 70s. We're labor. We're labor. We're labor. The paychecks are a little more now. You know, so, you know, this whole Jackie Robinson thing is very nice. And remember, Jackie Robinson had to evolve. Remember that they called him in front of the House Un-American Activities Committee to testify against Paul Robeson, you know? And Jackie said the right thing because Paul had told a group in Russia that, you know, if the Negro had to fight against the Russians, they wouldn't. And yeah, it was a very general statement because blacks have been fighting since the Revolutionary War.
Right.
But he was taking poetic license. Well, Jackie's, you know, in front of the House Un-American Activity said, well, you know, I think that's kind of silly and, you know, Negroes, and I don't know where Paul gets his information from, that kind of stuff. And it's very interesting, and they kind of used that. Very interesting that in his biography, autobiography, I Never Had It Made, Jackie Robinson writes in the very last page, and he wrote it in 1970, about a couple of years before he died or something, that he wrote that in 1953, and I testified against him, but you know, when I look back on it, I don't regret what I said, but I regret doing it.
Yeah, that's right.
And he said that because back then I had more faith in the ability of the white man to reform. Now I see that there hasn't been that kind of movement. That was one of the most profound statements. You know, so again, I keep going back to what this means, you know, what it means, what this anniversary means. What it should mean is that it should be a very profound truth, and it should be some deep introspection about really what's happened. But instead, it's turned into this feel-good party, as usual, where people aren't dealing with what's really happening, and they're dealing with something like over there, you know, about who doesn't know about who, you know. And I don't really care, frankly, because if you ask most ball players of any hockey, track and field, who anybody is, who played in 1930, they're not going to know, because that's not an athletic thing, it's an American thing. We don't know our history. And that's why this country is so morally bankrupt, because all we know is what's in front of us. You know, we know the present and we know money. You know, and so that's probably, I mean, that's a long-winded answer to your question.
Well, actually, you were saying something a number of people have said in conversations and speeches from the African American community. What does this really mean? Now, One part of the positive part of this is that the Jackie Robinson Foundation, which gives scholarships to African American youth,
Right.
organized by Rachel Robinson, is getting some benefit and sending some positive messages. That's a positive.
Sure.
The other part of it about the role of race in American society, which is what you're addressing, is one that's being debated even now. I understand that in the African American law professions, or African Americans in the law profession, they're raising the question about the role of race. Is the law colorblind?
Right.
Is the society colorblind? You and I both know, and the African American who walks the streets knows that the society is not colorblind. I think the thing we've been trying to work toward is how a society where race has been a predominant factor accommodates to a situation where in another 50 years race is not going to be a predominant factor, and even in this country, in that there are going to be a majority of people of color,
Right.
Although we get into questions of ownership. Who controls the media?
Right.
Who controls the messages? Who controls the means of distribution? And baseball, being the prototypic American game, then becomes the metaphor for what society says about race. And since Jackie Robinson went into the major leagues, some people were patting themselves on the back that, yes, this shows that America is a place for opportunity. But as you say, and as Jackie himself said at his induction in the Baseball Hall of Fame, just before he died, that he hoped he would look over to the third base coach's box and see a black coach, and look in the dugout and see a black manager. Managers, too, are really employees. The key to it is the ownership. Key to it is who runs the media, who runs the scheduling, who runs the properties. And there have been some minor breakthroughs, but the basic point that you described still exists, which then leads to the question, is what can African Americans in the sports profession do to help change some of this? I know in your columns you do a lot. You probably do more than anyone to point up the paradoxes in American sport regarding race and opportunity. But what can others, African Americans in the sport industry, athletes, writers, executives, do to eliminate some of this racism that still exists in sports today?
So I think that I had a very long, interesting conversation with Reggie White last night about a lot of these issues, and this issue in particular. And I think what has to happen is that the African-American athlete, no matter what he is, I mean, he's Indian or whatever, has to understand how powerful sports is and how powerful a position they are in this industry that's become this multi-billion-dollar global industry. These guys set trends in China in terms of the way they talk, what they wear. That's why these apparel companies are so eager just to give stuff to these guys free, because all this stuff is coming from the inner city. And they wanted, these guys are walking billboards, Jordan, all that, and they give them anything. And I think what they do not understand, because we haven't really made the transition, we as a group, as a community, are still seeing athletes as they were in 1947, in 1950. We still have sort of got that Jackie Robinson mentality. We just hope he can play. We just want Jackie to make the team. Well, we've got to a whole nother evolution now where two things. You talk about the media. Through the 50s and the 60s, it was the quote-unquote civil rights people who had the consistent access to the media, because that was what was happening, the horrors down in Alabama and all that. So the cameras were out because that's where the news was. Well, they don't have consistent access to the media anymore, the quote-unquote civil rights people. Who has a consistent access to the media now? The athletes, the African-American athlete. Every day, my paper, the New York Times, NBC, you cannot go a day, you cannot go any segment of an hour. You can't read a newspaper without seeing black athlete splattered across the page. They have the most consistent access. They have replaced, the civil rights people as the new leaders. The only problem is that their elevation to that position has gotten in front of their consciousness and their understanding that things have changed. It's like people at the turn of the century were, the barons were building railroads, but they didn't understand that they weren't in the railroad business, they were in the transportation business. So ultimately, when it came time for new modes, they got phased out. Well, it's the same thing with athletes, is that because of this whole production in which they get to that point, you know, like chickens who were raised and never see light of day, they haven't realized that, you know, in the Arthur Ashe organization, Arthur always talked about the athletes and leadership, and he was ahead of his time, you know, and that this is the coming thing now. And it's not a fluke anymore, it's not an accident anymore. This is as real as the technological age. It's here. The difference is that these athletes, Michael Jordan and all that, they haven't understood what this thing is all about now, that you are the new leaders because you have access to the media. And I got to tell you, the young people with all this power, you've got an army looking for generals. These kids, that's where they get most of their information from. That's where they're getting, not to Reverend Al Sharpton or Jesse Jackson, as much as I admire those people, or even Mr. Farrakhan for that matter. Each of those people has a niche, each one. But we're talking about people who have a wide range of people who watch them and listen to them. So you ask me what I think, that realization has to come on some people like Reggie, some young people that when we talk about role model, it's at a whole different level about being a role model. No, you have got a whole economic and political forum, and beginning in grammar school, and this has to do with the black community because we haven't really been focused in on this. We are thinking about it too, like Jackie Robinson. We're not really taking this serious as a $1 billion industry. Yeah. You know, we don't take it seriously. So, and by the time we do, all the resources are gone.
Well, what are some of the things they should, for example, as I think some athletes tried to do at one of the universities, go on strike. Say, we need black coaches. We need black general managers, and if we don't have one, we're going to strike. We need black ownership. If you don't have one, we're going to strike. How can that work? Because I know there have been some attempts to get athletes to buy franchises, but then it turns out they're just a front for other people to put money behind them. How can this consciousness show itself in actual practical application?
We had a forum. Again, it gets back to power. Excuse me, it gets back to power. You know, you grew up in that age, and you know, and I know, you know, there's a certain river that goes from, you know, the 17th century to now, you know, and there hasn't been a decade. Think about it, this is really amazing. There has not been a decade that's passed since the 17th century, actually since the 16th century, where there has not been some type of bloody struggle over this issue of race or whatever you want to call it. Not one decade, and it's all been about power. It's about pressure. Now we're at a phase where there's a group of African-American men, and now women are coming, who now have a lot of economic power in a global industry. Now the question is, well, how do they use that power? We had a forum the other day, a few weeks ago at HBO. And I was a moderator, and I posed a question. Buck Williams was there, and some white sports editors. And we're getting into this question that at the time the New York Post didn't have any black sports writers at all, you know. And so, I mean, at all, none. And so we were talking about normal things. Spike Lee was on the panel. So we were kind of getting into the same kind of the civil rights conversation, as I call them. What are you going to do? When are you going to give us power? You know. So finally I said, okay, why don't we take a hypothetical question? And this is to the editors. What would happen one day, one of your reporters came back after the Knicks practice or whatever, and he was kind of like a little upset. And he said, you know, one of the players informed me that my journalistic access will be cut off until we hire a black reporter. So all the reporters stopped, you know. And they didn't take them a lot of time. They just said, well, you know, we'd be in trouble. And one guy said, yeah, we probably have a black reporter by the end of the week. But it was very matter of fact, because everybody knows the game. It's all about pressure. It's pressure. If an athlete is being interviewed by camera crew and kind of jokes, says, yeah, don't have any black people on the camera crew, or the shoe company or whatever. I think that when at the Super Bowl, you know, that's when the owners hired all the coaches, you know, and they didn't hire any black coaches.
None.
Well, it's really the athletes who have to, see, they're doing it because they figure they've got these guys so under control and so scared and so co-opted that these guys aren't going to do anything. Collectively, one guy may say something over here, one guy may say something over there. Well, you know, they know these guys, because there's so many levels that we have to control them. We got the agents who act as a level of control. You know, we got so many controls, they're not going to say anything. But the power, to answer your question, the power, once again, has to come from within that group. When Michael Jordan, and we keep using him, but, you know, when Michael Jordan and Karl Malone and the Reggie Whites and the whomever, the Evander Holyfield and all that, each one of these guys is doing something. You know, every athlete you could probably pick out is doing something. The problem is the magnitude of the problems facing our community are greater than one individual's ability to do something. That's why what's missing is that we don't have concerted effort. Now, what we're dealing with is coercive force. There's always been coercive force, but there's never been concerted action to meet the coercive force. That's how come we are where we are. You know, one or two black coaches and crumbs here, crumbs there, because there hasn't been any concerted action. Now the question is, and that's what Reggie was saying last night, how do we do that? How do he's been trying to get to certain people. Certain guys will tell him up front, man, I can't get involved in that. You know, what are people afraid of? What are people millionaires, multimillionaires? What are they afraid of? It's got to be an invisible cage. You know, and frankly, it's not just them, all of us are kind of in that thing. So I think that my role, as I see my role as a journalist, and I was, my mentor was Sam Lacey, who was 96 years old, who was still the editor of the Afro-American newspaper. And I was reading,
who I read as a kid while I was going to school.
Yeah, and if you remember,
and I knew Sam Lacey. Yeah.
And he was talking the same stuff. He was talking the same stuff in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and basically what I'm doing now is just at another level. But you can only talk about that at some level. The athlete, I guess what I'm saying is that it's about courage now. And I think that if you want to analyze Michael Jordan, now he's at the end of his career, we're at the end of the century, and I think a very telling thing is this: people want to know, well, where is he going to stand up? Okay, if you now put Michael in perspective, the whole arc at the beginning of the century to now, talking about Jack Johnson, Joe Louis, Jesse Owens, Althea Gibson, Jackie Robinson, Muhammad Ali, even Tommy Smith, John Carlos. Now, does he fit in to that group as someone who will have this real long lifespan? Not as a great athlete, but other things. And I think you almost have to say at this point, no. And that's a very telling thing. And why is that? And that's about the missing element is courage and definition.
What about insight? Because many of the people that you talked about, all those people you talked about, came out of the black community, came out of segregated experiences, came out where they had to fight to get where they are. The one thing that disturbs me is that very few of the black athletes have black agents. And the agents are a major way of control because they control how they get their money and how they spend their money. What can we do to raise the consciousness? I know people like you, and to a certain extent those of us in the Author Athletic Association, try to raise this consciousness, but it takes more than that. Does it take some of our so-called economic leaders, political leaders, to call them to stand up?
Well, see, that's precisely it. I think there are two issues, and it's very interesting. We talked about the idea that the athletes have kind of replaced, in a way, potentially, the civil rights people as leaders. The problem in the community is that the civil rights leaders aren't ready to kind of step back and allow them to lead. They're still, we haven't acknowledged that the athlete is more than an athlete. So I think that there has to be an integration between the black economists, the historians, the John Hope Franklins, the key economists, the key political scientists. There hasn't been none of these people. And it's very interesting. If you read a lot of the great material of the Harlem Renaissance, or even a lot of the great stuff now, Manning Marvel has a great book now. He does a great cultural analysis. But missing in that analysis are athletes. And in every single major analysis of African American culture you read, African American athletes are completely left out. That's a large part of the problem. So now, all of a sudden, when these guys become these trillionaires, you just can't come lately and say, oh, we want to say, well, where have you been? We've not been part of the analysis. You know, but we are part of the solution. The problem that they have is that they don't quite have what you call the insight in their perspective. So I think that what has to happen in our community in terms of having forums, church meetings, at Abyssinian or wherever, you have to have these kind of discussions in private and in public, because the public and most African American people need to understand what it is we're talking about in terms of the economic resource, in terms of the fact that these people have a lot of power, but this is what happened with John Carlos and Tommy Smith. They rushed out there and raised their fist, but there was no what? There was no philosophy. There was no, when the establishment decided to crush them, they couldn't retreat to the black community for economic help because there was no philosophy, and that was part of the criticism of Harry Edwards, that it's one thing to push people out there, but it's another thing to have a philosophy and to have a safety net. You know, so you know, to say, Michael, jump on out there, but
well, of course, many of these athletes have a great safety net. They have more money they'll leave in 10 lifetimes. So that might be one safety net.
They can build their own
and
safety net.
of course, the consciousness that you've been talking about on the show today is exactly what needs to happen. The kind of conversations that we've been having today should be held in universities, churches, social organizations, with athletes and with people in the community who have power. Today, we've been talking about the role of athletics in the African American community, and we've been talking with William C. Rhoden, sports columnist of the New York Times.